Last time I talked to you, we talked about the early years of my grandfather's life, A.A. Kingwill, and I realized that to try and cover his whole life story in one talk was going to take too long, and so together with John we decided that we'd do it in two talks. So today we start off in 1902 when he was quite recently married and he was farming at St. Olives, and Kolonieplaas was advertised for sale. However, he had built up quite a flourishing cattle trading business, and he was very involved with cattle trading, and one of his best clients were the Free State government. Now, I don't know whether they had a specific scheme to restock the Free State, but be that as it may, he was so busy with his cattle trading that although he was interested in following up on the advertisement, he didn't have time to go and inspect the farm himself. So he asked his father if he wouldn't go out and inspect and have a look at this farm that was advertised for sale. His father came back with a very positive assessment, and as a result he decided to buy the farm. It was 9,000 Morgan, and he bought it together with the stock on the farm for £32,000. Now, I did explain last time that it's quite difficult to get an absolutely correct conversion of a pound at that time to a rand today. I've done my best to try and get reasonable comparisons, and it would work out to roughly 32 million in today's rands. He sold St. Olives for £8,000. So as you can see, he had a very significant bond to deal with, buying for £32,000 when he'd only sold for £8,000. But he was very fortunate that during his first 10 years on Kolonieplaas coincided with the height of the ostrich feather boom. And that was really the breakthrough that helped him to deal with this big debt, because he was making about £6 a year. That would convert into about 21,000 rand per ostrich during that time of the ostrich feather boom. Breeding pairs were selling for between 200 and 350 pounds. And interestingly, on one occasion, somebody offered him 350 pounds for a particular ostrich cock, but he thought it was worth more than that, and so he turned down the offer, and 2 days later the cock killed itself. So so during those first 10 years he was building up his stock of ostriches, but he also at the same time was building up cattle and sheep as well. But he organized 2 sales during that period on the farm, what we would call today production sales. But what's interesting about these sales is that on each occasion he had organized a train to arrive at Kolonieplaas. Now, there's a siding virtually on the homestead at Kolonieplaas. A train to arrive at the siding, one from the north and one from the south, each to arrive at 10 o'clock. And the sale started at 11 o'clock. The trains were to bring the buyers to the sale. And then he organized 2 more trains for 4 o'clock in the afternoon to take the buyers and the stock that they'd bought back home again. Now, it seems quite hard to imagine that a person can organize trains for his own personal advantage. But that is what happened. And interestingly, these sales, each sale produced a net return to him of £5,000, which would be, in today's terms, roughly 4 million rand. So that by the time the feather market crashed in 1913, so he only had 10 years of this the ostrich feather boom. But he'd made good money during those 10 years. And by the end of that time, he owned 800 ostriches. But what's interesting is that in the previous talk I mentioned that he and his brother had decided to move up to the Transvaal in 1893. And at that stage, the nearest rail connection that they could get was Rosmead. They had to go by cart and horses to Rosmead. So that dates the construction of this Graafrenet line to somewhere in the area of 1900, round about 1900, because at this time that we're talking about now, the train was already in operation along the Graafrenet line. By 1917, he had spent £14,000 on improvements. He'd paid off £10,000 on his bond. And that was in spite of the fact that in the first year that he was on the farm, he experienced a devastating drought. They measured only 40 millimeters of rain for the whole of the first year that he was there. And what made the situation much worse for him was that he was sitting with 500 extra cattle because the Free State government had suddenly decided to stop their cattle buying scheme. And he had these cattle ready to sell to the Free State government. And it was drought. And so it ended up that he found some grazing to fatten up the cattle in the Winburg district in the Free State. But in spite of that, he had bought these cattle for £11 each and eventually could only sell them for £6 each. So in addition to the drought, he took a huge loss on his cattle trading business. So not surprisingly, the neighbors were saying that this drought will finish young Kingwill. He doesn't stand a chance of surviving it. But obviously they had underestimated his tenacity and his problem-solving ability of this young Kingwill. Because although the drought did seriously curtail his development plan for the farm, he was undaunted and he managed to secure a bank loan of £4,000 to continue with his plans of development, particularly the development of irrigation on the farm. When he took over the farm in 1903, there was only 18.5 morgen of irrigable land. When he handed over to his sons in 1925, he had established 154 morgen. And by 1952, there was 246 Morgan, mostly under Lucerne. I don't know what the number is today, but you can see that there was a huge increase in what he managed to achieve during that time. And of course, this involved building weirs across the river, leveling lands. I don't know, those of you who know anything about farming know that when you flood irrigate, your lands have to have the right gradient in order for the water to penetrate correctly and all that sort of thing. So it was a real achievement. One of the weirs that were very necessary to turn the water out of the Sundays River, engineers had designed this weir for the previous owner, who was a Mr. Watermeyer. And they'd estimated the cost of building the weir at £4,000. Now this was way above what AAK could afford. And so he decided that he must do his own design, which he did, and he built it on his own way for £875. And so sometime after he'd built the weir, the government engineer came to have a look at this weir that he'd built. And when he'd examined it, he said to him, "This is a neat job, Mr. Kingwill, but it's only by the grace of God that it's still here." But years later, after numerous floods, the weir was still there and it was still serving its purpose, in spite of not having been built to the specifications that the engineers had wanted to build it. His ostrich business had done well enough for him to purchase his first car in 1912. And of course, in 1912, motor cars were still a rarity. There were very few around. So he had ordered this car, and when the dealer in Graafrenet informed him that the car had arrived, he came to town with his cart and horses to come and pick up his car. So the dealer, who was a Mr. Williams, provided a driver to take him with his car, take him out to the farm with the car. But he decided that he wasn't going to be driven around by somebody else. He was going to drive this car himself. So in those days, of course, cars didn't have self-starters. You had a crank handle to start them. And his first attempt at cranking the car into life was not successful. He couldn't get it to start. But obviously he hadn't read the manual very well because he hadn't switched it on. Anyway, when he got it going, then he started driving around in a circle on the homestead, and he had the whole farm staff there who were clapping and egging him on with, they'd probably never seen a car in their lives before. And so he gradually became more comfortable with his ability to drive the car. But then he suddenly realized that he didn't know how to stop the thing. And so apparently he shouted at the staff who were standing around there, "Vang my, vang my." Now, during the ostrich feather boom, he very wisely started establishing a registered herd of Friesland cattle and also a merino stud. And these, of course, became the lifeblood of the farm after the ostrich boom. And both the cattle stud and the sheep stud was started with imported animals from Europe and from Australia. Now, I don't know how long it took for the sea voyage to get a ram from Australia to South Africa in those days, but it must have been quite something. Then in 1918, when his Friesland stud was already quite well established and he was winning prizes on all the important shows, he had a particularly good cow by the name of Butterfly. And Mr. Harold Abramson, who was at that stage the Member of Parliament for Natal, was interested in buying stock from AAK at Colonies Plaas. And he was particularly interested in this one cow. But AAK said, no, the cow is not for sale, because it was one of his prize animals. But he said, unless there's a madman who comes along and is prepared to pay much more than what this cow is worth. So the story goes that Abramson then came back to Graaff-Reinet and spent the night at the Drosy Hotel and said to AAK, now if such a madman were to come along, what is the price? So he said £3,000. Now, bulls and heifers at that stage were selling for between 100 and 300 pounds. So you can imagine the magnitude of charging 3,000 pounds for this cow. And Abramson said, well, you've created a world record, but I'm taking the cow, it's mine. But the sequel to the story is that the cow then produced a heifer calf and then became sterile. And so all the efforts of vets to try and get this cow to conceive again proved fruitless. So the cow was sold to the butcher for 32 pounds. One of AAK's most expensive purchases was a bull, costing him 3,200 pounds. I think it came from Holland. However, the first two bull calves that he bred from that bull were sold at the Slough sale in England. One for 3,500 pounds and the other for 2,500 pounds. So I find it quite hard to imagine that a farmer here from the middle of the Karoo in faraway South Africa could actually be shipping stock to England to put them on a sale in England. But that is what was happening. He was actually shipping stock to England and putting them on sales there. Then during 1922, the Friesland Breeders Association here in South Africa exported 100 Frieslands to England. And the 14 of the 100 came from Colonies Plaas. And they earned him 23,000 pounds. Once again, converting it roughly would be about 1.7 million rand. However, because that had been so successful, they decided to send another consignment in 1926. But that consignment ended in disaster because the British Breed Society refused to register them in their herd book, even though they were actually of superior quality to the first group. And it seems that the reason for that was that the local breeders in England were by that time trying to sell the progeny of the first group where they had purchased animals. And so they decided that they weren't going to register these animals that were coming from South Africa. And so he wasn't even able to cover his costs of the export on that second sale. But one of the bulls that only fetched 60 pounds on the sale ended up winning first prizes on a number of shows in the United States. So obviously somebody had then bought it in England and taken it over to the States. Then in 1924, AAK's wife, Letitia Pack, Letitia, who was a Paxton, maiden name of Paxton, she became very ill. And the local doctor referred him to a specialist in Port Elizabeth. And the specialist in Port Elizabeth said that he needs to take her to London to consult with a Holly Street specialist in London, which he did, Dr. Braun. And Dr. Braun then referred her to the Queen's doctor, Sir Thomas Horder. But unfortunately, the diagnosis of the Queen's doctor was that there was actually nothing that could be done to save her life. And so she passed away in 1925, in October of 1925. Now, by that time, he had already handed over Kolonieplaas to his oldest son, William. Now, William was known to all as Colonel Bull, because he had earned that rank by serving in the First World War. He was the only one of the sons that had been old enough to serve in the First World War. So when the younger brothers, that was Dennel and Eric, when they finished their schooling at Kingswood, they worked for their brother Colonel Bull on Kolonieplaas. And I can remember my dad telling me that he was a hard taskmaster. And he told particularly about incident that when the two younger brothers would go on horseback, would go to a party on a neighboring farm, and they naturally, it took a long time to get there, it took a long time to get back. So they would get back to the farm in the early hours of the morning, and but Colonel Bull would monitor when they got back. And he would allow them just enough time to get undressed, get into bed, and get to sleep. And as soon as he thought they were asleep, he rang the bell for them to come to work to dig out potatoes. Then in 1921, AAK bought the farm Grootplaas, which was 4,600 morgen, and Middelvlei, which was 5,000 morgen. And that's where he established his son Dennel. Now, Dennel is, of course, Trevor Kingwill's father. And I'm sure you all know Trevor Kingwill. And then in 1925, which is exactly 100 years ago, he bought Rietpoort, where he established Eric, my father. So it's now exactly 100 years since my dad started farming on Rietpoort, and that's where I'm still living at the moment. These farms were all in the Murraysburg district, and the arrangement was that the sons leased the farms from their father, And that arrangement persisted until after the First World War. And then the sons actually bought the farms bought the farms from their father, and then owned the farms independently. Um, and it's interesting, I see that this year they're also celebrating the 100th anniversary of the building of the dam here in Graaff-Reinet. So the dam was obviously built at the same time that my father started farming. But I think the important factor is that it's as it is today, and obviously was in those days as well, that it was no mean achievement to be able to buy a farm or to establish each of his 4 sons on a separate farm. However, that almost led to his downfall, because during the worldwide financial depression between 1929 and 1933, that was after he had bought these farms and established his sons on the farms, the A.A. Kingwill, the firm A.A. Kingwill and Sons, was running at a loss of £2,000 a year. That's about 1.5 million rand a year was the loss that he was registering in the business. And he says that it was only through the cooperation of the banks that he was able to survive financially, because it took him until 1937 before he could once again balance the books. In other words, that the farms would once again be able to sustain themselves. Then in 1939, the Second World War broke out, and all 3 sons volunteered to join the army. So he was then again left with a situation that he had to manage the finances of all the farms while the sons were in the army. After Letitia passed away, he remarried to a nurse Meredith, and from that union a 4th son was born by the name of Arthur. So Arthur was almost a generation younger than the others, and he actually got the nickname of Oompie, because he was the same age as Billy, but technically he was Billy's uncle. And he was also educated at Kingswood College, and after he finished school, he worked for his older brothers. He worked on all the farms. He worked on Kolonisplaas for a while, and then he worked at Grootplaas. Now I can remember him working at Rietpoort for a while, and until a number of years later, AAK bought Windpoort, which was also in the Maritzburg district, and that's where he established Arthur. So then he was able to establish each of his sons, each of his 4 sons, on a farm. At the time when he was mayor of Graaff-Reinet, his second wife, as mayoress, was very involved with raising funds for the war effort. She was an active member of the Returned Soldiers Fund, the POW Fund, the People of Britain Fund, the Women's War Relief, and the Red Cross Society. But the interesting fact is that the Graaff-Reinet contribution to the war effort amounted to 91,000 pounds. It's about 67 million rand, was what the community of Graaff-Reinet actually, through these various organizations, contributed to the war effort. Now, before the outbreak of the Second World War, it was suggested to the town council here in Graaff-Reinet that it would be good for Graaff-Reinet if there was a road up to the Valley of Desolation. And so they appointed an engineer to come and have a look and try and sort out the route that such a road would take to get up to the valley. And the route that he initially suggested apparently started very close to the top of the dam wall and zigzagged up the mountain. But the estimated cost of building that road would have been £4,000, and the council decided it was quite out of the question, so the project was shelved. But apparently a few weeks later, Mr. Willie Dean, who was at that time a steward at the Graaff-Reinet Club, spoke to AAK and said that he could show him a better route to make the road by going up the kloof where the road is today. Apparently it was very difficult, even on horseback, to navigate up that kloof because it was very overgrown with prickly pears. But they did manage to establish the possibility of a route, and then the engineer also agreed that that was a better option than the original option that he'd put forward. So AAK and a Mr. Berger were then appointed as the construction committee. AAK had estimated that they could build the road for £1,000, taking into account that the previous idea was estimated to would have cost about 4,000. And so they hired 40 workers, an overseer, and they built that road with picks, shovels, wheelbarrows, and dynamite. There were no machines at that stage, that road building machines. And they then built that original road up to the valley, and they managed to do it for just over £1,000. It was opened in 1930, and it was proclaimed a national monument in 1935. AAK was also a member of the Divisional Council, which in those days were responsible for all the roads. And it was also during his term of office in the Divisional Council that they built the new pass up Oberg, because I'm sure most of you know that originally the pass up Oberg went on the other side of the kloof. It went up the other side of the mountain. And the new pass was built. It wasn't tarred at that stage, but it was built there. And the names of all the members of the Divisional Council that were involved is on a plaque. I don't know if you've all seen it, but it's near the top of the mountain. There's a plaque with the names of the people involved. And then he was also a prime mover in facilitating the building of the boys' hostel at Union High School, which bears his name. At the Kingwill house is the boys' hostel. AAK was very aware of the historic value of Reinet House. And so he was responsible for starting a public fund for the restoration of the old house. which was built between 1808 and 1816, but by this time was in a bad state of repair. It belonged to the Dutch Reformed Church, and the well-known Dutch Reformed minister, and we all know about him, Reverend Andrew Murray, occupied the house from 1822 until his death in 1866. And after him, his son, the Reverend Charles Murray, then occupied the house until his death in 1904. And he planted the famous grapevine, which is still growing at Renetta House. He planted it in 1871, which happened to be the year that A.A. Kingwill was born. But after the death of Reverend Charles Murray, the house was sadly neglected. It was temporarily used as a girls' hostel. It was temporarily used as a boys' hostel. But apparently it then got to the point where the church decided that they couldn't afford to restore it, and the church decided that it must be converted into flats. And that was where AAK and a group of other people from the local community decided that its historic value must be preserved. And so he managed to, with the help of the other people in the group, to secure guarantees for the purchase price of £2,000. And so Renetta House was then bought from the Dutch Reformed Church and transferred to the ownership of the municipality. But subsequent to that, of course, they still needed a lot of money to restore it and so on. And there were further donations of £2,500, and then the province subsidized those donations on a rand for rand basis. And that was what enabled them to restore Renetta House and turn it into a museum. Yeah, and it then of course became proclaimed as a national monument. So AAK continued to drive his big green Hudson that everybody in town knew very well from his house in Cypress Grove. He lived in Cypress Grove, and he used to drive from there to his office in town every day. And everybody knew that stop streets were not always honored very well. So everybody was aware that when you see the big green Hudson, you give him the right of way. And so he enjoyed the right of way, which I think he deserved after having spent a life where he was of great service to the community here in Graafrenet. And he was doing that until shortly before he died at the age of 95 in 1966. So, yes, that's the story that I've got for you. Of course, not complete by any manner of means. So thank you very much for listening.